we are basically.
E na mana, e na reo, e ra rangatira mai, no mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Helen Nicholson, tōko ingoa, tō tumu whakarai, tō pua, te whare wanaka o tāko. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, my name's Helen Nicholson and I'm the Acting Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special occasion to celebrate Rob Aitken's promotion to Professor. Inaugural Professorial lectures are great opportunities for us to take time out and to listen to our amazing staff and broaden our understanding of the research that goes on across the university. So it's good today to welcome many colleagues from the Business School and the wider university, as well as students and friends, and we're privileged to be joined by the Chancellor as well. I'd like to give a very special welcome to Rob's friends and family overseas, especially his son David, daughter Abby and brother Dennis, his mentors and former colleagues, Emeritus Professors Rob Lawson, Brendan Gray, Ken Deans, and to Anne and Brian, Leah's parents. Now, promotion to Professor at Otago is not something that comes easily, and Professor Aitken has gone through a rigorous process where he's demonstrated that he's achieved sustained outstanding leadership and sustained outstanding competence in 2 of the 3 areas of research, teaching and service. Now, Professor Gold in a minute is going to introduce Professor Aitken formally, but I just want to say a few words to set the scene. So Rob started at the University of Otago the same year as me, in 2000. He also studied for his first degree about 10 miles down the road from where I lived and grew up. And during the 21 years that Rob's been at Otago, he has demonstrated an enduring commitment to the university. He's been a successful teacher, winning OUSA and University Teaching Excellence Awards, as well as the Pearson Australia and New Zealand Marketing Academy Emerging Marketing Educator of the Year Award in 2009. His referees comment on him being an international leader in not 1 but 2 areas, marketing to children and also sustainability. As well as all this, Rob has also contributed significantly to the life of the university and the wider community. He was head of the Department of Marketing for more than 7 years and has forged strategic relationships with New Zealand marketing departments through the New Zealand Head of Department Network. He was elected to the National Executive of the Australian and New Zealand Marketing Academy in 2017, and such has been his influence that he was elected president in 2019. Rob has also been a member of various not-for-profits outside of the university, including the National Executive, being on the National Executive for Age Concern New Zealand since 2013. Congratulations, Rob, on your promotion. I'm really looking forward to your lecture. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Very, very warm welcome to you all here this evening. It's really wonderful to see you all here. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction for Professor Aitken. So Professor Robert Aitken joined the Department of Marketing, as the Acting Vice-Chancellor has said, in 2000, coming from the University of Exeter, where he taught media, communication and cultural studies. Robert's interest in how the media and marketing work to privilege particular areas and how culture influences their reception and affects behaviour continue to inform his teaching and research here at Otago. Robert has a deep interest in education and commitment to providing the environments in which people learn most effectively. So it's no surprise that he's, as the Acting Vice-Chancellor has said, one of only 3 lecturers in the Otago Business School to have received the university's highest Teaching Excellence Award, and in Rob's case, that was in 2009. He's featured several times as a top 10 finalist in the OUSA Annual Teaching Awards, and as has been said, one of only 4 New Zealand recipients of the Australian and New Zealand Marketing Academy's Emerging Marketing Educator Award. Now, Robert's interest in and commitment to education is reflected in his roles as chair of the undergraduate committee in the business school and director of the undergraduate teaching and learning committee in his department. Committed to staff and student development, Rob has recently initiated the Otago Business School Early Career Staff Development Program, and he has supervised over 50 research students in his career. Now, Rob's current research focuses on two major areas. The first is marketing to children, and in particular, the way in which commercialisation and the promotion of materialistic values are influencing the nature and experience of childhood. The second area is in sustainability and consumption, and how areas such as corporate social responsibility and business ethics can reconcile the tensions between business imperatives to make profit and social concerns to protect resources. On these and many other topics, Robert has published over 80 papers, with many in top-ranked journals. He has delivered invited lectures on these and other topics in Latin America, North America, India, Europe, and elsewhere. Now, in 2006, Robert helped to establish and develop the Otago Forum, which addressed the shifting idea of service-dominant logic. And this is considered to be one of the most influential changes in our understanding of marketing in the last 25 years. As the Acting Vice-Chancellor has said, Robert has been the recipient, based on this and other work, of the European Association for Consumer Research's Best Film and People's Choice Award for the ethnographic study of the cultural influence on consumption of the people of the Chatham Islands. He's also initiated and leads the Otago Business School's Research Network for Sustainable Business. Robert's been exemplary in many ways in his commitment to service. As has been said, he was for 7 years head of the Department of Marketing, completing his service in 2020. And then he's had various roles in the not-for-profit sector. He has been chair of the Save the Children Fund of New Zealand Marketing Committee, chair of Fortune Theatre Trust here in Dunedin for 10 years, and he's currently in his 3rd term as chair of Age Concern Otago. He's an executive member of the Otago Third Age Trust and an executive board member of Age Concern New Zealand, where he chairs the Finance and Communications Committee. He was very importantly elected to the board of Consumer New Zealand in 2019 and has been its chair since 2020. And we're very, very proud of the fact that we have the chair of Consumer New Zealand within our midst here at Otago University. This appointment in particular has given Robert the ability and opportunity to contribute his research expertise and social business commitment to championing the rights of consumers. And he is currently also, of course, the president of the Australia and New Zealand Marketing Academy, as has been said already. And that's the leading regional academy of marketing scholars in Australasia. Now, tonight, Robert's presentation will celebrate the people and the influences that have shaped his career. He will address the areas of research and, in particular, his work on sustainability and the ethics of marketing to children. He will also describe his contributions to the community and especially his involvement in the not-for-profit sector. So, Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors and members of the audience here tonight, I now invite Professor Rob Aitken to give his inaugural professorial lecture on the topic of To Travel Hopefully. Over to you, Rob.
Well, thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Salanjabar. Thank you very much for your lovely welcome and thank you for coming. To travel, hopefully, I think is my take on Robert Louis Stevenson's poem of better to travel hopefully than to arrive, because I think it's most important thing is about how you get there, the way you get there, not so much about getting there. Well, unless it's on a plane to Wellington, of course, in which case I think to get there safely is probably the most important thing. But generally speaking, I think it's important to learn the experiences of all the people that you've come into contact with along the way. And I am so pleased and proud and humbled by the people around me here today, as well as all my friends and relatives overseas. But it's so nice to have people here. Each and every one of you who I've worked with or I've got to know has kind of helped me along the way. So for that, I'm eternally grateful. Okay, so I was going to start off playing some music, because I think music can say a lot of things, but I was told you can't play music because it's the copyright issue. So, okay, well, in that case, I'll sing. I think that's quite a different way of starting, but my experience of singing is not too positive. Thank you to Mrs. Saunders, who was my intermediate school music teacher, who had a famous reputation for her school productions and her choirs. I remember being in the first class of hers, bellowing at the top of my voice, Jerusalem. You can't really sing Jerusalem slowly or quietly. And she would come round and say things like, well, a bit slower or a bit louder or a bit quieter. But she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, could you go and read to the juniors? So I won't be singing any songs, but my reading is quite good. So for that, I do have to be grateful. I think it's important before you start to be clear about your expectations, my expectations, hopefully, to travel, hopefully. And they are that it's been quite an interesting experience trying to think about how to put together a story about my life. And I've tried to piece some things together, mostly around the things that have influenced me and continue to influence me. And I'm also aware that, according to Jean-Luc Godard, every good story has a beginning, a middle, and end, but not necessarily in that order. So I'm going to make this quite an interactive session, really. I think every time someone says to me this is an interactive session, I go, oh no, I'd like to leave. But anyway, this is going to be interactive in the sense that I'm going to tell you my story, and it's up to you to try and make sense of it in your own sense. So this is not a passive sit back and listen. This is like, oh, okay, maybe how does that fit? I think somebody else once famously said that you don't really know what you're going to say, well, unless it's a speech or a pre-rehearsed statement. You don't really know what you're going to say until you say it. So I'm actually as interested in, as I hope you are, in what I'm going to say this evening. Before I start, I did that once before, and someone said, well, when you just get on with it. And I said, well, this is it. Anyway, I think it's important to, when you're trying to understand a character and where you've come from and what you've gained and what you've learned. And according to Charles Dickens, the way to understand a character is by what people say, what they do, and what other people say about them. So I'm going to start off just by reading out a couple of things from my students, from student evaluations, just to kind of set the scene. Robert is a fantastic lecturer. I love Robert's lectures. Actually, that's all the stuff I've been writing. Actually, what they really honestly said was, I like Robert's lectures, especially when he gets to the point. There's only a couple of these. I'm not going to go on to them. Why does he have so many slides and not use half of them? I love his lectures, but his rants annoy me. And my favorite one, because I think this sums up my attitude to education in general, he just asks too many questions and doesn't provide a single answer. So there won't be any answers tonight. But as I tried to tell my students, these are not tangents. He goes off on too many tangents. They're not tangents. Tangents, I don't know, they just go away. These are digressions. These are digressions that hopefully enable them to see what I'm trying to say in a range of different ways. But I will try and stick to the point this evening. I'm going to start with my childhood, even that is the beginning, and particularly to one of the two people on my dedicated presentation tonight, my dad, who I know most people start off by talking about the people who helped them along the way. But I'm going to talk about my dad and the ways in which he got in my way. Well, firstly, we need to recognize that I have a mixed parentage. My father and his family are from Scotland, and my mother and her family are from England. And so it's been quite an interesting upbringing to recognize the different cultural influences on people's lives. And even though it's the same country, it is not the same culture. And so although I know mostly the stories of Bannockburn and Stirling Bridge and Preston Pans and Culloden, I have almost no idea what my mum's family did during those kind of periods. Every family gathering would be embroidered and fused with songs from Scotland, so the Flower of Scotland and Loch Lomond. There would be battles between Kenneth McKellar and Cliff Richard. And so I've had to live a kind of rich experience of different cultural influences. But I have to say, if it wasn't for my dad, I would have been way less productive. I would have been much happier to sit on the couch and read, or go out and play football, or spend my time watching movies and watching TV, but oh no. That wasn't good enough for him. His kind of strong Protestant work ethic meant that I had to get up early, I had to feed the birds, I had to get the coal in, I had to clean the stuff around the fireplace, I had to get a job as soon as I was old enough, I had to ride my bike everywhere. So I do have to thank him in a way for the way in which he inculcated those values into my life and my experience and my expectations. So I have to thank him for my work ethic, for his values about doing the right thing, always doing the right thing, always trying to help people, always trying to be generous, even though my mum and dad weren't particularly well off. The fact that he was very resourceful, was very innovative, he was very creative. He was our kind of area where we lived in. He was the backyard vet, so people bought all their kind of animals and birds and things for him to fix and to help. And so I will just talk a little bit about that environment in which I was born and grew up in a town called Swindon in the beautiful county of Wiltshire. And as you can see, I guess, from some of those pictures there, that Swindon, Wiltshire, has a remarkably kind of rich history. It's got the Stone Age, it's got the Iron Age, it's got the Bronze Age, it's got the Romans. I don't mean they're all still there, I just mean it was part of its kind of history. And then it's kind of moving into the 21st century, 20th century, 19th century, the railways. It's a kind of confluence of the M4 and the Great Western Railways with enormously famous railway carriage building works, a bit like Hillside. It was a market town, so I could get the sights and the sounds and the smells of the countryside, even though we're in a town. It's got Avebury, which is the unsung major Stone Age kind of relic. It's got Stonehenge, of course. I've actually climbed over pretty much all of those stones, because when we were at school in Swindon, one of our annual trips was out to a place called Devizes to look at the museum and then onto Stonehenge. And in those days, we were allowed to climb all over them. So I've actually been on the altar stone. And of course, now you can't get anywhere near it, and thank goodness. But I have a kind of rich and intimate knowledge of some of these areas I'm pointing out. There's also Silbury Hill, the biggest man-made kind of monument, unknown monument. Nobody has any idea what it's for, from the Stone Age, presumably. The White Horse, several white horses, which go back into the Stone Age as well. And my own particular areas of interest were Marlborough Forest, Savernake Forest, depicted on a couple of pictures there, and fishing. So I was always out with my dad in the countryside fishing. Fishing, hunting, camping, tramping, birding. So I developed what I would consider to be a rich connection to nature. And if you are a fisherman or fisher people, or have any connection to the countryside, you'll know that to fish effectively, you really need to understand the life cycle of a trout. You need to know what they feed on, where they sit in the river, why they sit there, what feeds on the things that the trout feed on. So whether you're looking for stoneflies or mayflies or caddis larvae, you need to know that kind of life cycle. So without being taught it in a kind of formal way, I kind of learned to understand the kind of web, the web of all the connections, and if you mess around with this bit, you're going to mess around with that bit. So even though I wasn't conscious of those things in that sense, in that way, it's stuck with me. So when I talk about my work on sustainability a bit later, hopefully that you'll be able to see the connection. But what I learned from all this was, these early days, was my love of nature, the importance of the connections, and I became a vegetarian and joined the Hunt Saboteurs. So my connection to the nature continued to be in a much more kind of positive sense. Okay, I'm now going to talk a bit about some of the things that influenced me. I've just, again, during this process, trying to pick out these key moments or key things from all the books I've ever read. How do you choose one or two or three that kind of stick in your mind or made a difference? Well, there's a collection there. And I want to just draw attention to a couple of things. I'm not going to go through every one of them, you'll be pleased to hear. But the things that have given me my access to nature were the most simple, straightforward books that you could get hold of. So I have to say, the Ladybird series of books, particularly What to Look For in Winter, What to Look For in Spring, What to Look For in Summer, and What to Look For in Autumn, gave me this beautiful picture of what could be out in the countryside, and the kind of detail of the Observer's Book of Birds and the Observer Book of Nests and the Observer Book of Eggs enabled me to recognize and identify and also to help protect them. So I was lucky to have gained that kind of interest. Another area of interest that is depicted on here is that for some reason, having spent so much time in the countryside, having understood some of the folklore and the ways in which animals and birds and plants and trees and butterflies work and mingle, I wanted to run away. So one of my aims as a child was to run away and live in the woods. And I came across this book, Brendan Chase, which I read about 10 times, about this story of these boys who left a family for a whole range of different circumstances. They weren't, they weren't wanting to do it, but they chose to do it. So I tried to follow that, so I spent a lot of time trying to make dens and live off the land, so to speak. My other interest, also from the birds and animals that I was interested in, was a book called Kes, A Kestrel for a Knave. Both the book and the film had a massive effect on me when I was a young lad. I wanted to be a falconer. I started reading all the books about falconry and what you do and how you do it. A number of times it's mentioned in Shakespeare, for example. It's a medieval kind of sport, a kind of grand sport in many ways. Some of the language that we use today comes from falconry, things like fed up or wrapped around my little finger or under the thumb or hoodwinked or bated breath. They're all falconry terms. So also, I'm trying to make a tenuous link here to my increasing interest in language. However, rather than just reading about it, I thought, well, I'll actually try to do it, because, sometimes you don't know if you know something until you try and do it. So I read the books on falconry. I made the jesses. They're the kind of leather strips that you put around the bird's legs that then attach to a swivel, which you can hold on your hand or you attach to a perch. I made a hood. I made a leather glove. What I was missing, of course, was a falcon. Fortunately, I was able to obtain a jackdaw. Now, a jackdaw is a bit like a magpie. In fact, it's the Australian version of a jackdaw. And so I kitted this jackdaw out with its jesses and its hood and wandered around like this. It looked quite impressive, really. But what I really wanted to do was to get to a point where I could see some quarry, like a pigeon flying or a starling or something, and I could unhood it, and it would just kind of stay there, really. Just stay there for ages. So even though I learned the mechanics, I never got quite all the way through to actually doing what I really wanted to do. Which brings me to another part of this early childhood experience, and that is my engagement with consumption, consuming products. And I've just got a couple of examples here of how I was entirely conned, sucked in by marketing. There's a link there later. I'll remind you. So the first one was buying some jeans. My family were not keen on buying expensive jeans. They would buy them from the local co-op, where you got a discount. Actually, a very kind of community-minded organization in those days. But anyway, so let's just say that a pair of jeans in Tesco's were $5 and a pair of Levi's were $25. So there's no way I would get a pair of Levi's, except for my brother, who's looked after me all my life, really. So thank you, Dennis, if you're watching. But in those days, it sounds like I'm 400 years old. In those days, you had to buy your jeans shrink to fit. You couldn't buy them to fit you. You had to buy them 2 sizes too big. I was already pretty small, so even their smallest size would have already been several sizes too big. But anyway, I was determined, it was at the same kind of time that I was kind of, starting to stop wearing short trousers and starting to be a bit more interested in, But in fact, there were other creatures apart from boys. So I wanted to look quite cool in a way. So anyway, my brother bought me a pair of jeans, 2 sizes too big, as it says on the label. If you want to buy some jeans, you've got 30 waist, you buy 34. Okay, well, how do you shrink them? Well, how you shrink them, there's only one way in those days. Well, only one way I knew of. And that is you have to put them on and sit in a bath, and they shrink. Honestly, this is what happened. So I kind of was waiting for a time when my mum and dad would go out, and then I filled the bath up, but I didn't know whether you put hot water or cold water or warm water. What do you do? So I went for kind of warm water, put my jeans on, got in the bath. How long do you sit there for? I mean, do you watch them shrink? How do you know when you've lost 2 inches? Anyway, I must have been in there for half an hour. And we had in our house, there was the toilet and the bath were in the same room. And then I heard the door going, my family coming home. Okay, what do I do? My dad was, a very straight-laced guy, didn't really think about fashion or doing anything which was any different. Slightly kind of military view, I suppose, of how things should be. You buy things to fit, or you sew them to fit. You work it out yourself. Anyway, I hear the footsteps up the stairs. He comes into the bathroom, goes to the loo, and I can still remember to the day the look of him looking down here and then looking over at me in the bath with these jeans on. But anyway, they never ever fit. They didn't fit. So I was completely sucked in by the advertising and the marketing, and by the kind of sense in which I wanted to be cool, like other people. So that didn't work. So my second example of my engagement with marketing is on the razor comb. I got to that point around a similar time when I didn't want my dad to cut my hair anymore, especially with those little hand clippers, a bit like shearing clippers. I wanted a haircut. But he wouldn't pay for me to have a haircut. I didn't have any money. So I saw an advert for a razor comb. And all you do with a razor comb is you just comb it. That's all you do. It's really easy. It's straightforward. It doesn't take very long. Well, there you go. That isn't actually me, but that is what I look like. And the last example is one of the worst things you could do to me as a kid, one of the worst punishments was to make me stay in. If you don't do as you're told, Robert, you'll stay in. If you're not up by 7 o'clock, you'll stay in bed all day. It's like, oh, okay. So get up early, and I want to go out. And when it's raining, when it's tipping down the rain, there's nothing you can do, then you get to watch TV. So I do remember this very clearly, this example. Being sat on a really rainy, horrible, cold day in my lounge, me kneeling on the floor watching the TV. I think I was watching Cowboy, which I used to love. I think it might have been Cheyenne or Lone Ranger or something. But anyway, now my sister was sat on the couch reading a book. So my mum comes in and looks, with her look. It's one of those looks. Says, Robert, what are you doing? I'm watching TV. Well, why? Why are you watching? Why aren't you doing something useful? Why are you wasting your time watching TV? Why don't you read a book like your sister? It's like, well, because this is a cowboy. I like cowboys. Do something useful. Don't just sit there watching TV, wasting your time. Read a book. Yeah, but she's read that book like 10 times. It's like, fifth form at Mallory Towers. She knows every word in there. It's not active. It's not learning anything. I don't know what it's doing. But my point in mentioning that was that throughout my life, there's been a sense in which doing certain things, like, for example, watching TV, watching any form of media, is like, oh, it's not really quite as good as reading or doing something a little bit more refined and sophisticated. So I have a bit of a history of trying to fight against some of these things. Anyway, I'm going to conclude this little part of my formative development by reading from A.E. Houseman's A Shropshire Lad. I'm reading this because it's something I read at my dad's funeral. It was a kind of sense of the end of childhood. The war had taken place and things had changed. Also, it's the title of one of my all-time favorite plays by Dennis Potter, which is called Blue Remembered Hills. And into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires? What farms are those? That is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain, the happy highways where I went and cannot come again. On a much more positive note, moving into the second part of my presentation, I think one of the things I learned and gained was to see the beauty and hope and mystery and wonder and interest and curiosity and experience in everything you do, every tiny little thing. You don't need to do massive, great big things. Doing massive, great big things is good, but you can understand what those things might be from the smallest of experiences. And so this part of my life was a bit more, I'm going to call it kind of summative in a way, where some of the ideas that started to form much more strongly in my mind became more and more important. And again, from that whole mass of things I've read, that we've all read, I've only chosen these four, because I think they represent for me an enduring sense of the indomitable spirit of man, the capacity for great things, but also the ability to be destructive. And I was very, very taken when I read John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And for those of you who don't know it, just simply it's an epic story of a family's struggle from the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma to the promised land of California, where grapes grow and peaches grow, and it's a land of milk and honey. But not really. Not really. 150,000 migrants from the Dust Bowl to California. And their journey, their pilgrimage along the way, where they meet people who help them, people who get in their way, people who steal from them, people who injure them, is I think, a great tribute to man's, by man I mean all of us, capability and resilience to keep going. And it ends with what I would consider to be the most powerful ending to a story I've ever read, both tragedy and hope. And I hope that might be enough to interest you to read it, so I won't tell you what happens. That intense kind of experience is also represented in the works of Joseph Conrad, who I studied at quite some length, and particularly Heart of Darkness, which will be familiar to you, those people who watched Apocalypse Now, on which it was based. But Heart of Darkness was also based on a short story called Outpost of Progress, where Conrad experienced the horror of what could happen when you were taken away from society's kind of mores and values and laws, and just left with absolute power to do whatever you liked to whoever you liked. So that was quite stunning, really. My interest in this capability, obviously, represented in Lord of the Flies, which is, on the one hand, a boy's own story about kids who get marooned on a desert island. And we understand that they were not going to be rescued, so they're going to be there. They have to kind of make a camp. They have to work out how to organize themselves, how to order themselves, who's in control, who makes decisions, how they're going to get food, what they're going to do with it, who gets the opportunity to make those decisions. And we end up with two opposing sides, one led by a guy called Ralph, who I guess represents the sense of consensus and democracy and cooperation and collaboration and working together, and Jack, who represents, well, we're bigger than you, we're stronger than you, so we will decide what happens here. So yes, it's a story of boys working out what to do on an island, but it's also a sense of how we maybe deal with people who don't agree with us in general. And of course, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is a heartbreaking story to provide a different perspective on things I thought I knew about, but actually when I read those kinds of books, realized that I knew nothing really, and still trying to find out. So, a number of influences there, and now my academic influences, or the way they translated into academic influences, became increasingly interested in culture and how culture works, what influence it has. It's one of those words that sounds straightforward and easy, and we all kind of understand it, and of course we do in a way. We're all part of it, we all contribute to it, but according to Raymond Williams, it's the most complicated and complex word in the English dictionary. There's so many different ways of understanding it. I became really interested in meaning making. How do you make meaning? How do you make sense of things? How do you take an idea or an event and construct it in such a way that people can understand it or people can be persuaded by it? I was interested in how the mass media works to represent ideas, some ideas more than others, how it privileges certain ideas, and in what way. Interested in the way we perceive things, John Berger's ways of seeing. Given the cultural associations that we have with most things. And probably most importantly, the notion of hegemony, Gramsci's view that actually to kind of make sure that people kind of work together, whether they want to or not, you have to create, or you have to use things like the mass media to create some kind of sense of consensus. You have to make assumptions taken for granted natural, so that whoever has access to power is able to represent power in such a way that the people who are being, who are at the other end of the power system think, well, that's the way it should be. That seems fine. What's wrong with that? That's the way it should be. And I'm just trying to find a couple of discourses that might represent that, and I'm only going to choose two. One of them is happiness, satisfaction, and sex appeal are imminent. That means it's going to happen any minute, and available with the next purchase. So that's all you need. And the good life. How do you get the good life? The good life consists of buying stuff. So these are, I would argue, contemporary assumptions, taken for granted beliefs that are quite prevalent. Okay, and that was developed into my interest in the work, excuse me, of the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, established by Richard Hoggart in the early 60s, joined by Raymond Williams a bit later, and some of the more critical theorists of the 20th century. And in particular, the idea of mass culture. So I've always already interested in mass media, but about mass culture. And looking at the ordinary, everyday lives of people, rather than the F.R. Leavis classical canon of these are the things that are good for you, like ballet and opera and classical music and classical books, which are all fine and good, but they kind of represented the classical canon of what is great about civilization. And what wasn't represented was the ordinary, everyday, and often extraordinary experiences of ordinary people. And that became fascinating to me because I came from ordinary people. It's just a working class family that, tried to do the best that it possibly could with the limited means. And so when I started reading this stuff, and I started reading how there's a shift to recognizing the importance of understanding everyday activities, like being in a motorcycle group or being whatever musical genre you like. There are kind of rituals and ways in which you kind of recognize each other and the ways in which you kind of celebrate each other. So whether it's music or clothes, whether it's about the resistance to some of the more expected cultural behaviors, whether it's resistance through unionism, for example, and the ways in which the media kind of represent these things, all became a kind of mix of how I was trying to interpret some of my childhood, some of my more formative and summative reading, to understand how I can try and work a way through doing something about some of these things. During this period as well, I came across the work of Basil Bernstein. You'll be familiar with his work as a sociologist on looking at the performance of kids in schools. Why do some kids perform well in schools and others not? And of course, the prevailing idea was, well, it's kind of genetic. You know, you either inherit it. It's like nature or nurture. There's a big debate going on at the time. And he was interested. He was asked by the Department of Education to look into, well, why are these kids here in these schools not doing so well? Is it because they're not very bright? Is it because we need to provide more resources? Is it because the teaching's not very good? What is it? And the idea was, well, actually, you know, kids from the working class areas, so I'm just using that as a stereotypical term, but for kids from the kind of working class families tended not to do so well in schools. Their achievement wasn't as good, up to a certain level. Their behavior quite often wasn't that good. And if you get people misbehaving because they're not achieving, then it's a vicious cycle. Whereas it seemed that people from more middle-class backgrounds seemed to do better. Just generalizing, these are just generalizations. So he did an enormously extensive study of the performance of kids across the UK. And one of the things he decided to look at was, well, what's the language environment? What's the communication environment of these different cultures, should we call them? And, you know, I'm sure we might already kind of understand that language is the key transmitter of values, cultural values, political values, social values, communal values, whatever. So looking at language might be a kind of a starting point, at least. And so what he came up with, as you will be familiar with, is the notion of restricted code and elaborated code of language. It's been refined in a number of ways since and added to, but I think it was quite kind of groundbreaking in its time, and also fitted quite well with my interest in recognizing and celebrating different types of culture. But anyway, restricted code is characterized by a number of things, like there are usually a lot of instructions, a lot of demands, a lot of yes, no, closed questions. There is no recognition of the codes that are being used. It's just, this is what we do and this is how we do it. Whereas the elaborated code is much more open, it's much more about questions, it's much more about exploration, it's much more about not really being sure, but we'll try it out. We'll try and work these things out. It's full of adjectives and adverbs. This one over here was mostly nouns or verbs. I know it doesn't sound very important, but actually when you think about what is the experience of those languages, it starts to become more interesting. But anyway, these are the two codes he came up with. And then he analyzed, of course, the language culture of schools. And, well, you know, the language culture of a school is much more like the elaborated code than it is the restricted code. And so kids quite often found it quite difficult to come from this fairly limited use of language into an environment where they were expected to be expansive and explorative and innovative and creative in their languages. These kind of kids found that much easier in that early stage. So what happened was that this was one of the pieces of research that led to much more formalization of early childhood, of early education, to provide much more of a kind of level playing field before you started to get into learning more complex things. Now, it's not to say that the elaborated code is richer or better than the restricted code, because I come from what I would say was a restricted code background, but we had songs and poems and people telling stories all the time. But in general, there was this kind of ways in which language was used quite differently. So, the last thing I want to talk about in this area is, because of my interest in popular culture, and this is also almost entirely for Hamish Spencer's benefit, I said I would mention this. One of the things that Richard Hoggart and his contemporaries at the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies did was to look at the ordinary everyday experiences of people. So they looked at things like wrestling, they looked at things like darts, they looked at things like bingo, they looked at greyhound racing, they looked at all of those kind of everyday activities. Well, what resonated with me was pigeon racing. And I remember talking to Hamish quite some time ago about pigeon racing, and he said one of the things that people had said to him, because he is a biologist, a zoologist in fact, was that they couldn't understand how pigeons knew where to go when they were racing. How did they know where to go? How did they know how to get there? Well, of course, they're not going there, are they? They get taken there, they're just flying back. They come back home. They're called homing pigeons. That should have been a bit of a giveaway, really. But anyway, so my dad raised pigeons. That was one of his kind of passions, in addition to being a backyard vet and a wood turner and an inventor and somebody who made me get up early in the mornings. He also had pigeons. And it was my job to feed the pigeons. And on a Saturday, on the day before the race day, unless it was an overseas day, in which case it would be Wednesday, but let's just say it's Friday, it's my job to go with my dad down to the Pigeon Club at the Working Men's Club in Swindon. At that time, there was something like 87,000 registered pigeon fancying clubs in the UK. Now there are 13,000. Anyway, and it was my job to help basket and ring the pigeons. So you get a pigeon, you have to kind of put a rubber ring on its leg, and the rubber ring has a number on it, and your number's against your name. Then it goes into a basket, and then the baskets go into a big container, and the container drives away, and then at 12 o'clock on the dot on Saturday morning, they all get let off. They all fly back as quickly as possible. Pigeons come into the loft, as that one in the top right-hand corner does. I take the ring off the pigeon's leg. I put it in a brass thing, which is just under the picture of the pigeon, and I put it in the clock and press the button, and it clocks the time. So it's, quite a simple process. Absolutely fascinating, I think, now, because in the same way that to understand fishing, you have to understand what it feeds on, where it lives, and what it does, but to understand pigeons, you have to understand what time of the year it's best to send them, when they're breeding, how do you get the colors, are some colors better than others? For example, my dad would never have a white pigeon in the loft because, they never flew as good as blue ones. There's a whole culture around the colors. My dad taught me how you worked out the genetics of pigeons. So if you had a red checker with a blue checker, you might end up with a mosaic or a blue hen or something. In the same way that, when you're looking at breeding animals, you can work out what colors you want. And why I just mentioned it, in addition to the fact that it was something I grew up with, and then recognized it through the work of Richard Hogger. Well, actually, this is a serious, it could be a serious academic study of why people do it, and what are the rituals and ceremonies and experiences and cultures that go with it. Anyway, last year, that pigeon there was sold for that amount of money. So it's not just a trivial thing, is it, if it's worth that amount of money? Okay, and the last one is the one that I guess out of all of them had the biggest effect on me, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Initially, the name was because of her fear that where she was living, there wouldn't be any more birds singing in the morning because they're all dying from pesticides and poison. So she was I think she was the one who made the environment, put the environment on the map. She was the one who started the environmental movements. She was the one who provided the scientific evidence of what was happening and was the one who bore the brunt of the big petrochemical companies who were producing the poisons and pesticides, especially DDT, that she wanted to get rid of. So I'm greatly indebted to, even though it's an apocryphal, dysfunctional vision, it did lead to, I think, strengthening my resolve to try and do something. So this is the reflective part. And I think as a teacher, that is my job. I'm not saying I've got a gift, I've found what I'm interested in, and now I'm trying to get other people interested in it. And I'm trying to say why people might be interested in it. So why marketing? I mean, I've already given you some examples of why marketing didn't actually work very well for me. Why on earth would I move into marketing? Well, so I've got a background in understanding work in the media, in meaning making, in consumer behavior, in understanding culture. Marketing needs and works with all of those things. So I thought, even though it wasn't a normal trajectory, it had enough things I could make a contribution. But when I started reading some of the textbooks in marketing, I noticed that pretty much all the language was about warfare. There was like targets, or the front line, or make a killing, or, price war. So, whoa, this subject has some way to go, really. Where are all the metaphors about family, or gardening, or like an ecosystem? None of them. I have to say there's more than that happening now. And also the shift in marketing over the last few years, partly in relation to the service-dominant logic that Robin mentioned, was an emphasis on relationships. Businesses want a relationship with us. They want to create some kind of loyalty. We know about loyalty schemes. But I always think, well, if you kind of want some kind of loyalty from your customers, you have to give something. So I say to my students, actually, I think the relationship should be based on the same kinds of ways in which you would judge a personal relationship. So the way you would understand if a personal relationship is worth it is like, so is the person you're in a relationship with, are they honest? Are they truthful? Are they transparent? Are they open? And if so, then maybe that's going to work. So does business do that? How far does business go? If it wants a relationship, how far does it go in providing the environment within which I might want to have a relationship with a company? So I thought marketing would be a good place to start. And I guess the most important bit was that if marketing, and in many ways, possibly reasonably, if marketing is responsible for getting us to this place, couldn't it also have the capacity to get us out of it? If it can persuade and convince and encourage people to do these kinds of things, surely it can be used to get us out of that situation. Which is why I thought marketing would be quite a challenge. And it would also enable me to teach. It would enable me to teach marketing from an eco-friendly, systemic kind of point of view. It would enable me to talk about frugality and voluntary simplicity and the ways in which people conserve and are resilient and can recycle. And that would be a perfect opportunity. A perfect opportunity to deal with this situation we're in. I'm not going to spend too much time going through the details of this, just enough to frame how I've kind of dealt with my concerns with what's happening around us. Many of you will have seen these kinds of representations of the Earth systems, either the social systems or the Earth systems. On every possible count, we're losing or we're increasing our likelihood of losing the resources we need. On every single measure, what we need is to recognize that the present global system isn't working. So we really need a massive transformation of the way things are structured, but I can't do that. So I have to work out, okay, so what can I do to kind of help? One of the things I'm interested in trying to deal with are some of the contrasts on this slide. So moving and increasingly trying to work with students to understand what the implications of being a shareholder are in comparison to being a stakeholder, and what does that mean, and what role can they play in that. Much more interested in moving beyond measures of GDP as they're normally done, and we're getting some way towards that with putting well-being into some of our measures. Moving from a linear method of production and consumption to a much more circular one. And I guess one of the most important ones, having a long-term rather than a short-term view of things. So alongside that have been the development of the United Nations sustainability goals. And although people complain there are too many of them, there are fewer than there used to be, so I think that's a step forward. And they're still on the agenda, so we still can pick off some of it. I think that for us in the areas of sustainability, the fact that we've got a dedicated Sustainable Development Goal number 12, responsible production and consumption, gives us the license, gives us the encouragement to start developing plans to how we might approach that in terms of our research and our teaching. So that has been a great boost, and also in the School of Business, as you'll know, we have the SDGs as a strategic imperative. We're signed up to a number of organizations that are also trying to do that. So there is of course, there is a groundswell in trying to change things. We take some issue with the United Nations, who are we? But we take some issue, the people I work with the United Nations view of sustainability being dependent on three equal pillars, the social pillar, the environmental pillar, and the economic pillar. We think that's not going to work. What you have to have is, we have to have the environment as the number one underpinning for all of this. And the economy is just a tool to enable sustainability of a society to develop. It shouldn't be on an equal footing. So we think there needs to be a rethink of that. Just a quick look at where New Zealand's doing. This is the early days. So we think we're really good at all of these kind of things, but if you look at number 15, well, if you look at life on land and life underwater, we are not doing too well. How does that fit with the pure, clean, green reputation that we have? So we have a long way to go. But we are making some steps towards it. These are just some defining statements that we have used to frame the research network for sustainable business that Robin mentioned. These are the kinds of things that we think actually make it impossible for us to continue doing what we're doing. And so we set up this network to try to pool all the resources of people around us, to work alongside the Centre for Sustainability, which is doing a fantastic job at looking at the major areas of energy and power and transport. But we thought, well, we need to focus on some things that we could do something about. And what we decided to focus on was the consumer. The role of the consumer. We should have some expertise and experience and ways in which we might be able to make some kind of influence. So we divided our ideas into answering these kinds of questions with a view to hopefully increasing the ability and the opportunity for consumers to consume more sustainably. We know, for example, that 30% of consumers, when they're interviewed, say that they would like to consume sustainably, but actually only about 3% do. So why is that? Apart from social desirability bias that we know has an effect, why is there such a massive gap? Why is there such a massive attitude behavior gap? So these were some of the things that we wanted to look at. How do you motivate people who are not already behaving sustainably to be more sustainable? So we found the model, of course, which suggests that there are some ways here that we could work on. What's the information that people need? What are the barriers that people are up against? What are the cultural influences? So we took the opportunity to work, to provide some questions in the New Zealand Lifestyles study that Rob Lawson started back in the late 1970s. Not quite up there with the Dunedin study in many ways, but comparative in the sense of, well, what do people think and feel across New Zealand? So every 5 years, we do this study, a representative study of the people of New Zealand and try and categorize them into looking at their behaviors, their attitudes, their opinions, their consumption habits, to see if we can segment the New Zealand population. And the more that we can try to find some commonalities amongst some of these segments, the more efficient and effective we might be able to be in promoting these kinds of behaviors. So it's a very simple idea in many ways, and it's been extremely valuable for the department, I think, and for individuals within the department to have this kind of resource and this kind of data available. The latest one that is run by Leah Watkins will be being published in the next couple of weeks. And I think there's an interesting segment that's emerged in this one. And I know what goes on tour stays on tour, so it's not public yet, but it's what we're calling the new New Zealanders. for the first time seeing a segment that is anti-discrimination, anti-materialistic, much more accommodative, of more liberal views in the sense of how people and communities can work, of a certain age group and a certain kind of educational background. So it's like, whoa, okay, so this kind of assimilation, this mixing, maybe is starting to happen. But anyway, before we could carry on, we needed to find out who we were working with. So one of the groups that we came up with was what we called they were called in the literature conscious consumers. We've called them conscientious consumers, because conscious is kind of being aware of something. Conscientious is probably doing something about it. So we were thinking, well, what is it that motivates people to do this stuff? Is it their moral foundations? Is it their values which underpins why they do what they do? So we did some research on trying to work out, okay, what are the relationships between people's moral foundations, their political beliefs, and their likelihood or not to engage in sustainable behavior? And just simply, without going through all the details, I mean, the more liberal left, you may not be surprised to hear, are more likely to consume sustainably. The more right-leaning right are less likely to, unless it seems it's more moving towards being compulsory, or that there are some kind of external incentives to do it, or that there is some recognition of that behavior. Now, why this is important, again, is because, well, as marketers, that should give us some ways in which we might work out how we might promote those kinds of behaviors to those kind of people, rather than do the scattershot, generalized appeals, most of which don't work. One of the other barriers that we identified was, and you, again, this is one of those things that if I asked you to come up with a list of 5 things that stop people from consuming sustainably, you'd probably come up with the same list. So in some ways this is confirmatory, but for us it was quite incisive, because it enabled us to focus on one of the things that we thought we could do something about, which is encouraging businesses to provide more information. In a free market, for a free market to be free, you have to have equal access to a whole range of resources, and information is one of those resources. And so when companies are saying that they're being sustainable, they're providing this, well, really, are they providing the amount of information, the type of information? What kind of information do consumers actually need? So A, we identified that they want information. They've got enough knowledge about the issues. They know the issues, by and large, but what they don't know is how they can do something about it through their product consumer choices. And increasingly, we're finding that consumers are using their consumption as a kind of proxy for what they believe in. More and more consumers are buying things from companies who they think are doing the right thing. That is one of the trends that I think we've recognized over the last few years. So we can't really get companies really to do much about price or convenience or availability, but we surely should be able to encourage them to provide the kinds of information that their consumers want. A couple of other projects that have been developing alongside the Conscious Consumers one is firstly the literacy project. We were astounded by UNICEF's figures when they were doing the global survey into building our future, children and the SDGs, to find that New Zealand kids were pretty low, almost the lowest in their knowledge of the relationship between sustainability, consumption, and the environment. And so we're developing a project which is going to try and increase the degree of literacy of kids in schools as a way of starting this process. And if it's a circular process, you have to start somewhere. And we just relatively recently, completed the backcasting project, the envisioning project. Quite simply, if you can't imagine what the world's going to look like, how do you possibly get there? So on the one hand, we know that young kids are not very familiar with sustainability and its implications. What about tertiary education? What about kids and students at this age? What do they know? Well, we were really surprised to find that they were actually not just very knowledgeable, but actually very concerned about making some kind of a difference. They felt that education was central. They felt that the government was central. They felt that technology would make a difference, not provide all the answers, which I think is a common misunderstanding. And they felt that the community would provide some kind of leadership in working towards a more sustainable future. And so we asked them about, okay, imagine 50 years. You have to do 50 years rather than 10 years, because if you do 10 years or 15 years, it's kind of too close to what's happening now. If you do 50 years, you have to make a bit of a jump. So, okay, 50 years' time, what would life be like in terms of housing and food and clothing and travel? And from those ideas, the idea is that we would then work backwards to work out what needs to be done, like what kind of policy changes, what kind of government intervention, what kind of government incentives need to be done. We are just now working on this project. There was a call from the planetary health aim of the Lancet for looking at the implications of having a non-sustainable economy. But one of the items within it was, well, what about, where does consumption fit? Where does materialism fit? What is the relationship between materialism, which is the desire for more and more products or possessions, and the mental health, for example, the self-esteem, for example, of people who can't afford them? If you have a constant bombardment of advertising things to people who can't afford them, and let's just say some of those people might be more vulnerable, they might be older, they might be younger, what effect does that have? So it's not just the physical stuff that has been looked at. We're looking at, okay, so what are the psychological, sociological, cultural impacts of that kind of constant expectation of having to consume more and more? Which brings me to my pet subject. So one of the research projects that we were particularly pleased about, because this was a great example, I think, of the fusion between what's important to teach and what's important to research. So some of you will remember back in 2013, Fonterra launched a free milk in schools project, a pilot project up in Northland to begin with, mostly in low decile schools. And then as the project seemed to be quite successful, they then expanded it out for the rest of the country. So now, well, not now because they've just stopped it, but up until relatively recently, you could get free milk in schools. Okay, so that sounded like a really good idea. But of course, as researchers, we have to go, yeah, well, that sounds good. And the mass media representation of it, the support for it, the encouragement was absolutely overwhelmingly positive. The biggest philanthropic contribution to New Zealand society ever, $10 million a year that Fonterra was giving to schools. Of course, overwhelming support for such a project. But when you start to think about it, and when you think about the context, it provides a number of interesting issues for students to consider. One of those quotes about too many questions, I suppose. But one of the questions is, so why are they doing this? What might be some of the reasons? I mean, some of them were quite explicit. Fonterra did make it clear they wanted to make a contribution to the community. However, if you just think about Fonterra's history, relatively recent history, they were involved in a number of unpleasant examples of adulterated milk in China that led to the deaths of some children. They had to do a massive global recall of their products because of suspected tampering with some of the production lines. There was quite clearly a decline in milk sales. And I guess if you add those up, there was a sense in which there's some kind of public relations, reputational damage. And at the same time, there was quite clearly a move towards the intensification of dairying in New Zealand. So not saying any of this is good or bad, just saying, well, actually, there's some questions here that we really should ask. And then you think, okay, so what they're doing is they're providing free milk in schools. So as an act of philanthropy, one of the characteristics quite often of philanthropy is it's anonymous. Well, this was Fonterra's anchor milk in schools. It was quite clearly labeled, as were the fridges that it was kept in, as were the waste paper baskets that they were chucked away in. So it's a branding exercise. in many ways. If it's a branding exercise, if it's marketing in schools, is that a good thing? We already have some concerns about the commercialization of childhood, the constant barrage and bombardment of advertising products throughout the whole of our life, but certainly at childhood level. Are kids at that age, this is primary school age, are they able to recognize the difference between a brand and marketing exercise and just a genuine offer of help? At what age do they become more critical? Certainly, from all the research that we looked at, not until later than this. If it's provided in schools, is that a way of legitimizing it or endorsing it because we look to teachers and schools to give us the right things? So there were a number of issues that we considered to be worth exploring. And I think overall what we kind of felt was that, well, firstly, the milk was going mostly to low decile schools. Low decile schools are mostly the ones with children whose healthy eating habits may not be as well developed as others. Their obesity levels are much higher. So is milk the right product for people in those situations? Which is another question. According to the American Medical Association, it isn't. Whose role is it to provide a healthy start to the day? Is it the government's role? Is it a parent's role? Is it a commercial company's role? And what is the relationship between commercialization and education anyway? So we were able to use what we got from this research to inform some teaching and to ask the kinds of questions that any critical engagement with any phenomena, any experience, we were suggesting should be asked. And we finalized the teaching of that with the quote which says, "No ethical, moral, social, or spiritual justification for advertising or marketing to children." That's pretty powerful. Anyway. So how does all that affect or influence or have anything to do with my other role in a number of organizations? Well, as both Helen and Robin pointed out, I'm a proud member of consumer organization and have been able to influence not massively what it does, because I'm just the chair of the board, I just mostly do go through the minutes, but every time we have a strategic development day, I'm able to make some impact in how they might shift the emphasis. So you will have noticed, I'm going to take all the credit for this, of course. There's been quite a shift in their campaigning over the last few years, much more about pushing things like free range. What do we mean by free range? What does it mean? What are the implications? Everybody will be aware of the sunscreen debacle. This is advertising and marketing saying that these products do these things. A bit like the razor comb, really. Maybe it's just the way I used it, but I mean, maybe it could be used properly. But this is a sunscreen. People are relying on this to give them the kind of protection that they need, particularly for children. How is it that in the 21st century we have some major companies still promoting products that don't do what they say they will do? And we've had the examples recently of Nurofen, being fined $150,000 for saying, actually, if you've got back pain, you should take this one. If you're feeling a bit low, you should take this one. If you've got a headache, you should take this one. If you've got period pain, you should take this one. Actually, they're all the same, but they're all priced differently. How can that be? So you do need a watchdog like consumer, and like I said, I'm very pleased to be part of it. And our interest in providing information, recycling, packaging, it's been able to be translated into some of the issues that are being investigated by consumer. And so these are all current campaigns with a view, I hope, to kind of changing some of the ways in which we do things. On one level, it's about changing behavior. On another level, for the sunscreens, for example, it's about changing the law. Where are the standards for these kinds of products? At the moment, there aren't any standards. We rely entirely on the company to tell us what's in them and what they do. And the one I'm really very pleased to be part of is the recent development of the Built to Last campaign. started in America as a kind of right to repair, is now one of the major elements of what consumer does, trying to encourage companies to move away from some kind of planned obsolescence, which of course increases the opportunity for more and more production and more consumption, to go, well, hold on a minute, we should have the right to repair it. Those little labels on the back of your technical advice that says, if you come within 5 meters of this, the warranty will be disallowed. You're not allowed to unscrew anything. Well, how does that fit with a kind of innovative, resourceful, resilient way in which we might kind of keep things going? And the last one I will mention in relation to a consumer is, again, if we're trying to help more people make better choices, then we need to provide them better information. And so we have got this relationship with the Electricity Commission or Authority, where we actually get a certain percentage. We get $25 for every person who goes onto Power Switch to check their power bill, to work out what the comparative costs are from all the providers in the country, to work out what's the best, are they on the best plan? We're working at the moment to try and disentangle some of those plans, because it's quite hard sometimes to work out just how much you're paying for power if you've got your telephone and your video and whatever. Video, that dates me a bit, doesn't it? Just pretend I didn't say video. Or your digital device, all wired into the same things, or not wired, of course, to enable people to make those kind of choices. We're trying to do the same with broadband, to provide people, especially the people who need it most, with access to that information. However, the biggest group of people who subscribe, because it's a membership organization, there is no government funding for consumer. I know this does sound like an advert, so I'll try not to make it seem too much like an advert, is a subscription list. But most of the people on the subscription list are people who probably could afford most of this. So how do we extend the opportunity to get this information to a much wider group of people? And that's hopefully where some of my experience and expertise might be useful, because we are struggling. Our membership, because they are comprised of a certain age group of people, shall we say, are not increasing. How do we increase the numbers of people at this end? How do we should we sustain a subscription model? We have one thing to sell, really, and that is information. How do you sell information in this way? So that's what I'm kind of working on the next strategy meeting. Okay, we are pretty much getting close to things now. Oh, right. I just saw somebody nodding. Not supposed to just go, no, I don't think so. As I said, Hogmanay, I have my Scottish family singing Scottish songs, and my Uncle Alec reciting is there for honest poverty. But it's always been at the back of my mind, that poem, especially the last verse where it says, I'm hoping that, one time the optimism for the future is that we do kind of share things, we do come together, we do work more collectively and collaboratively. And so to Robbie Burns, I have a great deal of debt. The other elements of hope is that we belong to the Future Earth global network, people led by Professor Maury Cohen, who's made a massive impact on looking at production and consumption around the world. So we are very proud to be part of that. And although we can try and work on some elements of consumer behavior, change, attitudes, beliefs, opinions, at the same time, what's happening, and you'll have seen in the news over the last couple of days, where some governments around the world are being taken to court by their communities for failing to provide the kind of care and custody that they think they deserve. So is there an opportunity for this to be developed through legislative change as well, through government intervention or to changes to the law? And I'm very proud of the fact that the Wanganui River was one of the first natural resources in the world to be given citizenship status, which may have some lasting effect on how the resource of a river is consumed. What rights does it have? And so this is not my last slide, but almost my last slide, which I think might be sort of, but it is time really to say thank you to the people who have particularly helped me along the way. I'm going to start with my family and my closest friends. So this is a long list, but it's It's a bit I've been waiting for, actually. I don't mean because it's at the end. I mean because it's the people who mean most to me. So I'd like to give my grateful thanks to Dennis, my brother, for looking after me through all his life, to Jackie and Stuart for looking after Dennis, to Dave, my son, who's working as a Royal Society for the Protection of Birds warden in the biggest gannet colony in the mainland of England, Simon for all his quiet counsel, for Abby, her sparkle with life, for Libby, for her cheeky smile, for Ali, a sense of adventure, and for Eve being a constant delight and travel companion, and someone who now is interested in geckos. So that link from my interest in animals and birds, who knows? I'd also like to pay tribute to and celebrate my other family, Charlie for just being a joy to be around, an absolute joy of life, trying everything into everything, and knowing what's right. To Georgia for her infectious enthusiasm and her challenging independence. For Will, just for being such a nice guy, such nice company, easygoing, someone you'd delight to have as a friend. And to all of them for making sure I didn't come up with any dad jokes tonight, and for telling me and reminding me every single day I'm not quite as smart as I think I am. To Anne and Brian, Leah's mum and dad, who were kind of so welcoming to me, who every day demonstrate what good grandparents and parents should be, have an absolute sense of what's right and wrong and the courage every single day to make that clear. Always concerned with people's well-being and health and happiness, and also being so positive and constructive and thoughtful about everything they do. So it's a tribute. And to Julie and her boys, so nice to be part of you as well. And you always have a positive attitude and an informed opinion on everything, which makes arguing a real delight. I come from a family of arguers, as you can imagine, my Scottish side, so no social situation is complete without an argument. I would also like to say thank you to Matt, Eve's fiance, just for being such an honest man and for looking after Eve so well. And for my friends overseas, so sorry about the list, but Jenny and Pete, Steve and Pip, Mark and Helen, Emma, Tim and Jan, Paul Cleve and Big Ian. For my friends and colleagues here, especially to Marie, who I handed over my head of departmentship to, from Ken Deans, who has been a lifelong friend and colleague, who also got it at the baton from Rob Lawson, who got me started in this whole area. You'll be very pleased to hear. And Rob and Brendan were my dream team supervisors. Couldn't have wished for better people to work with, both the expansive knowledge, but also the sensitivity of how they did things. But the rest of my department colleagues, it's been a joy to work with them and continues to be. From people up and down the school, Paul, Holger. If I don't call your name out, doesn't mean you're not special. Just means you're not on the special list, but you could be on but you are still special. To Moira and Stuart and Joe and Kathy, Claire, both Claires, Claire Dorking and also Claire Ramsey. To Sandra, Ken's lifelong partner, to Kirsten and Stuart, and to David Ballantyne and Jackie Ballantyne, who were over in Australia now, but were a lovely part of our department for quite a long time. To John Williams, really close friend, and to Peter Brown, always got a smile on his face. To Dave and Penny, Barbara and Gisela, Marg and Pete, and to my dear long-time New Zealand friends, Warren and Robert van der Viver. To Russell Belk, who helped me along the way as an academic, to David Marshall in Edinburgh, who helped me along the way, and to Maury Cohen, who has been a great inspiration to me. Now, just to finish off on the last person who got in my way, stopped me in my tracks, and that's my beautiful partner, Leah, my traveling companion and the love of my life. Thank you for your unwavering belief, your gentle encouragement, your endless patience, and for making everything such a joy. I would not be here today if it wasn't for Leah. I'm absolutely sure of that. I was quite happy where I was. I kind of reached a certain level. It's like, oh, it's pretty comfortable here. I can do this and do that. Oh no, it's not good enough. So I thought I'd reached my potential, and I'm a bit of a dreamer, so it's like I like to kind of dream about things. I don't actually like to do much. So that was not going to work. So I'd like to thank you for your inspiration, for your caring, honest, thoughtful, pragmatic, constant watching for everybody else's benefit. A great tribute to Anne and Brian. Looking after everybody, always knows what's the right thing to do, and again, making sure she does it. And my absolute and utter respect. And I think one of the quotes I remember is that kind of helped me get here really was, well, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it? So she has been with me through every step of this journey, and for every step of the rest of the journey. So thank you very much to everyone. That's it.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou koutua. My name is Marie Tyne, and as the Head of Department of Marketing, it is my absolute pleasure to deliver an address of thanks to Professor Robert Aitken for his excellent lecture today. Professor Aitken has outlined to us the many influences upon his research and his academic journey. In particular, the impact of his twitching, his interest in nature, and his desire to uncover a holistic understanding of our relationship with nature. Rob has outlined his vast research experience and his contribution to business and the community, and in particular, the not-for-profit sector, through his roles with Age Concern and more recently, Consumer New Zealand. It is very clear the significant contribution that he has made. Rob has covered several of his research themes in the lecture today for quite some time. His passion for sustainability and questioning the role that marketing plays is evident, with his call for the need for transformation and transformative changes in how we produce and consume things. With an extensive background in consumer behaviour, Rob has researched what motivates and drives people to consume sustainably and ethically, what the barriers are to sustainable consumption, and the role and the importance of information and marketing messages and media in assisting consumers to make sustainable choices. Rob spoke of his research specifically around ethics and marketing, and in particular, the Fonterra and the Milk in Schools campaign, ultimately raising the question around the role that marketing plays in getting us into and then out of trouble. It is very typical and fitting for professorial lectures to focus on research. But as many of you know, the promotion to professor requires sustained, outstanding leadership around research, service, and teaching. And I believe that Rob has consistently demonstrated all three. Rob's passion for teaching is evidenced by his numerous and enviable teaching awards. Rob's ability to communicate with students, to encourage critical thinking and application, and his all-round good humour and warm personality has driven his success in imparting knowledge to our large undergraduate and smaller postgraduate classes. Since embarking on his career as an academic, Rob has always been an effective, popular, and engaging teacher. So Rob is an excellent teacher, he's an excellent researcher, and yet he still finds time to be an overall great citizen, within and outside the university. I've already mentioned his roles in Age Concern and Consumer New Zealand, but until this year, alongside those positions, Rob was our head of department. for 7 years. There was a little gasp in the audience when I said that. It's a long time to be in the role, and Rob held that position during a significant period of change within the university. A challenging time for anyone, but especially for a head. Rob was an excellent leader for our department, stimulating and driving curriculum development and research initiatives. And I think I speak for all of the department when I say there was not one time when Rob was too busy for us or in any way unapproachable. His door was always open, his advice, words of wisdom, and support at the ready. Rob, you are a people person. It's no wonder you ended up a professor of marketing, since marketing is all about people and value and relationships. Your academic contribution is undoubtedly significant. Your work has made a difference in consumer behaviour, in marketing ethics, in sustainable consumption, and your service contribution to our department, division, university, and community is outstanding. And alongside all of this, I want to personally thank you as my colleague, my mentor, and my friend. Congratulations, Professor Aitken. And as a sign of our appreciation to your awesomeness and a big thank you for your lecture today, a little something. And now it just leaves me the pleasure to invite you over to the staff club for light refreshments and to continue the celebrations